In order to propel a 93,000-ton supercarrier at the highway speeds, mid-century naval engineers made a brilliantly reckless decision. They essentially bolted 8 separate submarine reactors together inside a single hull. When the keel of the United States ship Enterprise, officially designated carrier vessel Nuclear 65, was laid down in 1958, the sheer scale of the project defied all conventional maritime wisdom. The United States Navy had demanded a capital ship that could theoretically operate for years without refueling, completely untethered from the slow-moving logistical train of fleet oilers. Because high-output surface fleet reactors did not yet exist, the Design Bureau was forced to adapt existing attack submarine technology, resulting in a massively complicated labyrinthine engineering plant that birthed the fastest, most complicated warship of the 20th century. This brute force engineering choice cursed the vessel to a lifetime of maintenance nightmares, requiring tens of thousands of sailors to dedicate their lives to managing hundreds of miles of pressurized primary coolant piping and countless isolation valves. Yet, it also created an irreplaceable strategic asset that would completely rewrite global naval doctrine for the next 50 years. During the late 1950s, the strategic doctrine of the United States dictated that naval aviation must be able to strike deep into the heartland of the Soviet Union from oceans away. Conventional carriers, like the Forrestal and Kitty Hawk classes, were undeniably formidable, but they were permanently tethered to an oceanic umbilical cord. A conventionally powered carrier burning heavy fuel oil at high speeds to generate wind over the deck for heavy jet launches would nearly drain its vast bunkers in just a few days of sustained combat operations. Admiral Hyman Rickover, the fiercely uncompromising father of the nuclear navy, saw atomic power as the ultimate emancipator of the surface fleet, offering unlimited high-speed endurance that would forever alter the geometry of naval warfare. The fundamental engineering challenge, however, lay in the raw physical scale of a supercarrier, compared to the only nuclear vessels the Navy had successfully built up to that point. To move a floating steel city through heavy seas at speeds exceeding 30 knots required well over 280,000 shaft horsepower, a staggering figure that simply could not be generated by any single nuclear plant conceived at the time. Thus, the carrier vessel Nuclear 65 project was born not out of elegant architectural simplicity, but out of absolute uncompromising necessity and a willingness to embrace staggering mechanical complexity. The resulting vessel was initially supposed to be the first of 6 sister ships, forming an impenetrable wall of atomic supercarriers to dominate the global oceans. However, as the true financial and engineering costs of this sprawling prototype began to emerge, the Navy quickly realized that they had created an operational behemoth that was simply too expensive to replicate, yet far too strategically valuable to ever lose. If detailed technical breakdowns of naval architecture and maritime strategy interest you, subscribe. I have got more of these deep dives coming. The heart of this floating fortress was the A2W nuclear propulsion plant, a designation standing for Advanced Two-Water, meaning it was a pressurized water reactor system. Because a modern supercarrier required immense continuous steam pressure to drive 4 massive propeller shafts and operate 4 voracious steam catapults simultaneously, engineers were forced to divide the thermal load across 8 identical reactor cores. These 8 individual atomic furnaces were paired off into 4 separate auxiliary engineering spaces, each feeding a massive reduction gear that turned a single bronze propeller shaft stretching into the sea. This meant that the engineering spaces took up a colossal amount of internal hull volume, tightly separated by immense layers of lead, heavy plastics, and high-yield steel radiation shielding. This heavy shielding heavily restricted crew movement and made simple maintenance tasks incredibly arduous, requiring technicians to carefully navigate secure checkpoints just to read a simple analog gauge. If a mechanical coolant pump failed in a primary loop, engineers could not easily bypass it and move on. They had to navigate through a labyrinth of radioactive containment doors, specialized high-pressure ventilation systems, and tightly packed machinery just to diagnose the fundamental issue. Maintaining strict water chemistry across 8 distinct primary loops required an army of highly trained nuclear technicians operating around the clock in an environment of unrelenting noise and oppressive heat. Yet, the tactical payoff for this logistical and maintenance nightmare was an absolutely blinding top speed that the Navy officially listed as strictly classified for decades. Sea trial records from 1961 proudly indicate that the massive ship comfortably exceeded 33.6 knots, and anecdotal accounts from veteran bridge crews suggest she could push even faster in a dead sprint. That raw, sustained speed allowed the massive hull to easily generate enough wind over the deck to launch heavily loaded strike aircraft, even when the surrounding ocean was dead calm, a feat that conventionally powered carriers frequently struggled to match. Furthermore, when sprinting from one operational theater to another, the ship did not have to slow down to rendezvous with vulnerable underway replenishment ships just to top off its own fuel tanks. The massive internal voids that would normally hold black fuel oil were instead utilized to carry an unprecedented volume of jet propulsion fuel 5, drastically extending the time the air wing could conduct heavy bombing sorties before needing a resupply. This meant the massive vessel could launch strikes off the coast of Vietnam, turn its bow toward a new threat in a different hemisphere, and arrive at the new combat zone days ahead of any conventional battle group. Beyond the sheer power of the atomic plants, the hydrodynamic design of the vessel was an absolute marvel of mid-century naval architecture, designed specifically to handle extreme weather. The hull featured a beautifully flared enclosed hurricane bow and a massive beam of 252 feet, engineered specifically to shrug off severe blue water storms while maintaining absolute stability for flight deck operations. To maneuver a vessel displacing over 93,000 long tons at highway speeds, the designers broke from traditional twin rudder designs and equipped the ship with 4 massive steel rudders. One rudder was positioned directly behind each of the 4 huge propellers, ensuring that the wash from the spinning bronze screws blasted directly over the control surfaces at all times. This unique configuration gave the helmsman an unprecedented level of low speed bite and high speed maneuverability, allowing the ship to turn with the agility of a much smaller destroyer. When the helm was put hard over its speeds exceeding 30 knots, the massive ship would lean aggressively into the turn, banking so steeply that the flight deck edge would practically kiss the ocean swells. This dramatic heel would send unsecured equipment and unwary sailors tumbling violently across the hangar bay. But this terrifying agility meant the supercarrier could quickly evade incoming torpedoes or rapidly spin into the wind to launch an alert fighter interceptor. However, this 4-rudder setup immediately introduced a new nested challenge, creating 4 times the hydraulic complexity and requiring heavy-duty steering gears that constantly demanded fresh seals, hydraulic fluid, and obsessive preventative maintenance. Moving from the subterranean depths of the engineering spaces to the sky-scraping heights of the superstructure, the designers faced yet another massive challenge in revolutionizing naval sensor technology. The aggressive pursuit of the future manifested in the ship's distinctly blocky, bizarre-looking square island, which completely lacked the traditional clutter of rotating radar dishes that defined mid-century warships. The designers had chosen to install the groundbreaking ScanFAR system, which consisted of the Surface Search Radar 32 and the Height Finding Radar 33, utilizing massive fixed-phased array electronic panels. These enormous rectangular flat arrays were slapped directly onto the 4 flat, square sides of the island's superstructure, giving the ship a futuristic, almost brutalist silhouette that was instantly recognizable on the horizon. The theoretical capability of these electronic scanning arrays was staggering, promising to track hundreds of incoming high-altitude Soviet bombers simultaneously without the inherent mechanical failure points of physically rotating antennas. The Combat Information Center buried deep in the hull was supposed to receive a seamless, 3-dimensional picture of the airspace, vastly improving the coordination of the combat air patrol fighters. In operational practice, however, these early vacuum tube-era electronic arrays proved to be a catastrophic drain on the ship's electrical grid and a major liability to its physical stability. The massive radar panels generated so much internal thermal friction that they required their own dedicated massive chilled water air conditioning plants just to prevent the delicate electronics from literally catching fire. The panels themselves were also incredibly heavy, adding tons of dead weight high above the ship's center of gravity, which negatively impacted the metacentric height and forced engineers to carefully manage the ship's liquid ballast loads. Over time, the maintenance crews found that keeping the thousands of individual electronic phase shifters operational was a nearly impossible task in the corrosive, highly saline environment of the open ocean. Saltwater spray, heavy vibrations from the 4 steam catapults, and the extreme thermal cycling constantly broke the delicate radar components, leading to deeply frustrating system blind spots. Eventually, the Navy admitted complete defeat on this specific piece of bleeding-edge technology, aggressively stripping the massive flat panels off during a comprehensive 1979 refit. They replaced the entire phased array suite with conventional rotating radar dishes, leaving the ship with an unusually shaped, heavily modified boxy island that served as a visual reminder of her experimental origins for the rest of her long career. Knowing what you now know about its performance in heavy seas and those brutal maintenance demands, do you think the design trade-offs for that 8 reactor speed were worth it? Share your thoughts below. While the immense engineering plant and experimental radar systems dominated the physical blueprints, the daily operational reality of living aboard carrier vessel Nuclear 65 was defined by a brutal, exhausting operational tempo. By the late 1960s, the ship was heavily engaged in launching daily combat sorties off the coast of Southeast Asia, forcing the young crew into an endless cycle of arming jets, launching strikes, and recovering returning aircraft in pitching seas. The open flight deck was an intensely hostile, unforgiving environment where sailors lived in a deafening, exhaust-choked atmosphere of roaring jet engines and slamming steel catapult shuttles. A single misstep by a tired flight deck handler could result in being instantly sucked into a jet intake, crushed by moving aircraft, or blown entirely over the side into the unforgiving ocean. The deck plates vibrated violently every time one of the Carrier Type 13 steam catapults fired off, violently ripping steam from the secondary propulsion loops to hurl 40,000-pound fighter jets into the humid tropical air. Below decks, the 5,000 men of the ship's company lived in tightly packed berthing compartments, dealing with the relentless noise, the smell of aviation fuel, and the constant throbbing vibration of the 4 massive propeller shafts driving the ship forward. The inherent, ever-present danger of this high-stakes aerial ballet culminated in utter disaster on the morning of January 14, 1969, while the ship was conducting operations off the coast of Hawaii. A Mark 32 Zuni rocket, heavily loaded on the wing of an F-4 Phantom fighter jet, accidentally cooked off due to the intense exhaust heat of a neighboring aircraft starting its engines. The unguided rocket fired blindly straight across the crowded flight deck and violently ruptured a heavily fueled external drop tank on an adjacent A-6 intruder attack aircraft. The resulting massive fireball ignited a catastrophic chain reaction, rapidly heating and detonating 500-pound Mark 82 aerial bombs that were stacked nearby. The devastating concussive blasts sent blindingly hot shrapnel tearing through the pressurized fire mains, severely damaging the delicate flight deck plating and instantly killing dozens of sailors in the immediate vicinity. The surviving damage control teams faced a literal vision of hell, desperately battling roaring jet fuel fires that threatened to melt entirely through the armored steel deck and spill burning kerosene down into the cavernous, tightly packed hangar bay below. The raw heroism displayed by the sailors during that raging inferno remains a legendary case study in naval damage control, structural survivability, and sheer human endurance. Young men, many of whom were barely out of high school, grabbed heavy canvas fire hoses and charged directly into literal walls of flame, using their bodies to shield one another as secondary bomb explosions blew massive holes straight through the flight deck. Up in the smoke-filled bridge, the captain immediately swung the massive ship violently into the wind, attempting to use the gale force ocean breeze to aggressively blow the thick, choking black smoke and spreading fuel fires away from the undamaged aircraft parked tightly on the bow. Deep in the subterranean bowels of the ship, the nuclear engineering technicians watched their damage control panels light up with catastrophic shock warnings, yet they remained sealed inside their isolated compartments. They desperately fought to keep the 8 independent atomic reactors online and providing uninterrupted power, knowing that if the ship lost its electrical grid, the critical fire main pressure would immediately fail, dooming the vessel. By the time the vicious flames were finally extinguished several hours later, 28 brave sailors had lost their lives, over 314 were severely wounded, and 15 expensive combat aircraft had been completely destroyed in the fierce blaze. Yet, amidst the tragic loss of life, the fundamental structural integrity of the massive nuclear hull emphatically proved its worth against devastating internal explosions. Despite directly absorbing the explosive force of 18 massive aerial bombs detonating on her deck, the ship's heavily reinforced internal bulkheads and armored decks held firm, completely preventing the vessel from sinking or suffering a catastrophic magazine detonation. This tragic but highly illuminating incident completely revolutionized how the United States Navy handled flight deck ordnance, permanently altering training protocols across the entire surface fleet. It led directly to the accelerated development of modern insensitive munitions that will not easily cook off in a fire and vastly improved aqueous film-forming foam firefighting systems that are still standard issue on supercarriers today. After the smoldering ship limped back to port, the shipyards worked at an astonishing pace, cutting out the warped, blast-damaged steel and welding entirely new flight deck plates into place. Within just a few short months, the massive vessel was repaired, fully recertified, and sent straight back to the combat zone, a testament to both the resilience of the shipbuilders and the unrelenting strategic demands of the era. When she was not fighting fires, launching strikes, or outrunning storms, the world's first nuclear supercarrier waged an equally desperate and costly battle against the relentless forces of galvanic corrosion and mechanical fatigue. Keeping an incredibly complex prototype vessel fundamentally seaworthy required long, agonizing stints in heavy dry docks, where the true operational cost of those 8 submarine reactors was exacted in blood, sweat, and billions of taxpayer dollars. Refueling a nuclear aircraft carrier is always a monumental engineering task. but attempting it on a ship with 8 separate pressurized water reactors meant systematically dismantling vast sections of the ship's internal architecture. Shipyard workers had to painstakingly cut through multiple layers of heavy armored flight deck, highly reinforced hangar bay plating, and thick lead radiation shielding just to physically reach the sealed atomic cores. A single comprehensive overhaul and nuclear refueling cycle could take upwards of 3.5 years to complete, effectively removing a massive strategic asset from the global chessboard for an agonizingly long period. The shipyard workers and nuclear technicians had to operate in incredibly cramped, highly regulated environments, meticulously unbolting primary coolant boundaries while wearing heavy, suffocating anti-contamination suits that caused immense physical and mental fatigue. The sheer, overwhelming financial burden of feeding, maintaining, and repeatedly upgrading this entirely unique vessel led many defense analysts to heavily question her long-term financial viability, yet the Navy consistently chose to pay the massive bill. The strategic value of having a proven, highly resilient ship that could dash from the Persian Gulf directly to the Sea of Japan at 30 knots without pausing for fuel was simply too great an asset for the regional combatant commanders to relinquish. The operational lessons, painfully extracted from decades of keeping this aging giant afloat, directly dictated the far more refined, streamlined design of her eventual successors, the formidable Nimitz-class supercarriers. When naval architects sat down to formally design carrier vessel Nuclear 68, they looked closely at the sprawling, claustrophobic 8-reactor plant of her predecessor and immediately realized they needed a far more elegant, centralized solution. The resulting engineering breakthrough was the development of the mighty A4W reactor, a massive, highly efficient atomic power plant that generated so much thermal steam that only 2 of them were required to push a 100,000-ton ship well past 30 knots. By drastically slashing the total reactor count from 8 down to 2, the structural engineers suddenly freed up massive amounts of internal hull volume, totally changing the internal arrangement of the ship. This extra space allowed for much larger aviation fuel bunkers, significantly deeper and better protected magazines for heavy aircraft ordnance, and vastly improved living quarters for the thousands of enlisted sailors. Maintenance cycles were drastically reduced in overall complexity, as the engineering crew only had to safely monitor and systematically maintain 2 primary coolant loops instead of navigating a chaotic, radioactive web of 8 fully independent systems. Yet, despite the newer Nimitz-class ships being vastly superior in terms of logistical efficiency and modern ergonomic design, many veteran engineering sailors who served on both classes quietly maintained a deep respect for the original prototype. The newer twin reactor ships mathematically take slightly longer to answer a bell for full ahead, whereas the older vessel's heavily decentralized steam plant could supposedly spool up and bite into the ocean with a ferocity that no other ship of her immense size could ever match. The redundancy of having 8 independent plants meant that the ship could sustain massive engineering casualties in combat and still maintain enough steam pressure to keep launching jets and steering the vessel out of immediate danger. The final legacy of this massive atomic pioneer is written not just in the historical combat records she broke, but in the sheer, stubborn physical endurance she displayed over a half-century of unbroken service to the fleet. Commissioned during an era when primitive jet fighters were still a relatively new concept and finally retiring in an era defined by stealth fighters and unmanned combat drones, she adapted to every strategic shift. She operated seamlessly through the tense days of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the grinding combat sorties of the Vietnam War, the high-stakes chess match of the Cold War standoff, and the dawn of the global war on terror. She survived the terrifying reality of explosive flight deck fires, the relentless structural pounding of the heavy Pacific typhoons, and the slow, inevitable creep of metal fatigue that eventually breaks all vessels born of forged steel. When she was finally officially inactivated in the year 2012, she had served for 51 continuous years, a staggering record for a supercarrier that required thousands of sailors to constantly wage war against aging pipes and obsolete analog wiring, just to keep her systems breathing. Even long after her final deployment, the deactivated ship remains a monumental engineering headache for the United States Navy. Safely dismantling the massive hull and permanently disposing of 8 deeply embedded, highly irradiated reactor compartments has proven to be an ongoing logistical nightmare for the naval shipyards. The ship was inherently flawed, incredibly expensive to maintain, and massively complicated, a vessel that mathematically should theoretically never have lasted as long as she did under such punishing conditions. Yet, she stubbornly paved the exact atomic path that every single modern American supercarrier now sails, serving as the ultimate, irreplaceable testbed for high-output maritime nuclear propulsion. She proved once and for all to the Admiralty that atomic power was not just a fascinating scientific novelty, but the absolute, unquestionable cornerstone of modern blue water, naval supremacy. The lessons learned in her cramped, sweltering engineering spaces and upon her scarred, windswept flight deck ensured that the carrier strike groups of the 21st century could project unquestioned power across the globe, silently carrying the legacy of the 8-reactor giant that started it all. If you found this analysis useful, A-like helps more people discover these deep dives. Thanks for watching.